I never imagined the people I fed, clothed, and sheltered for decades would one day sit across from me and tell me I should live less comfortably. They told me I should live less comfortably. But the truth is simpler. They just wanted to live more comfortably at my expense. But there I was, 78 years old, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of chamomile tea, while two adult children I once rocked to sleep stared at me like creditors, not family. The words didn't come out of their mouths gently. They slipped out sharp, clean, practiced, like it wasn't the first time they'd rehearsed it. "Mom, you don't need all this," my eldest said, sweeping his hand around my living room. "My home, my comfort, my memories." My daughter nodded in agreement as if they were delivering a verdict I should have expected. "Yeah, Mom," she said. "You live alone. You're retired. You don't need to keep spending money the way you do. We think you should simplify. Live smaller. Live." She paused, trying to find a polite word. "Less comfortably." I felt something inside me shift, like a small crack forming in a porcelain plate you've held onto for years. They said it with the same tone people use when they tell an elderly woman she shouldn't be driving anymore. But this wasn't about safety. It was about them. I placed my mug down carefully. My fingers trembled not from age, but from insult. "I'm Marlene Townsend, 78 years old. Retired school librarian. Widow of a gentleman who built us a life with steady hands, simple faith, and quiet generosity. I have 2 children, both grown, both busy, both well-dressed and well-funded, thanks in part to the very credit line they now expected me to maintain for their comfort. But that day something inside me woke up, something I hadn't felt in years. A quiet alertness. A watchfulness. The feeling you get right before a storm arrives and you're the only one who can smell the electricity in the air. They thought they were guiding me, protecting me, helping me make better decisions. But everything in their voices told me otherwise. My son's knee bounced under the table, impatience. My daughter kept checking her phone, distraction. Neither looked at me the way children look at a mother. No softness. No warmth. Just expectation. And beneath it, a hunger I recognized too well. Money. But I didn't respond right away. I simply looked at them, their faces older now but still the same expressions from childhood. My son's practiced confidence. My daughter's careful diplomacy. I wondered when they had stopped seeing me as their mother, and started seeing me as a financial safety net. As they talked, budgeting ideas, downsizing plans, responsible decisions for my age, I drifted back to old memories. Soft ones. Ones that tasted like warm biscuits and sunshine. Saturdays spent at the creek. My daughter's first school play. My son falling asleep on my chest after crying from a nightmare. Back then I protected them from fear. Protected them from hunger. Protected them from the world. And now here they were, ready to take away the little comfort I had left. But I remained quiet. Silent. Because something inside me whispered, "Don't react. Not yet. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves fully." So I did. And by the end of that conversation I knew 2 things clearly. They didn't come to check on me. They came to adjust me, to reshape my life so it better benefited theirs. I watched their faces as they left my house, satisfied, self-assured, already anticipating the changes they were sure I'd make. When the door closed behind them, the house fell into a thick, heavy silence. I sat back down, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and let the truth settle in. They didn't believe I was strong anymore. They didn't believe I was paying attention. They thought age had softened my mind, weakened my resolve, dulled my instincts. But they were wrong. I knew exactly what they were planning. I could feel it, smell it. And I also knew something they did not. I was not done fighting for myself. Not yet. Not ever. As I stood to refill my tea, another thought slipped into my mind. Quiet, calm, but powerful. If they wanted me to live less comfortably, I could certainly teach them how that feels. And that was the moment, right then, when the story truly began. That night, long after my children's cars disappeared down the street and the porch light flickered against the quiet hum of the neighborhood, I found myself sitting in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the gentle ghosts of my life. Picture frames, bookcases, quilts stitched by a younger, steadier version of me. The clock ticked loudly, louder than usual somehow, as if marking the moment something fundamental had shifted in the foundation of my world. I sat there replaying their words, not the literal sentences but the tone beneath them, that strange combination of entitlement and impatience. You should live less comfortably, they had said, as if comfort was a luxury I hadn't earned through decades of sacrifice. As if the warmth of this home, the softness of my blankets, the groceries in my fridge, the little outings I took with my granddaughter on Saturdays, were indulgences meant to be trimmed away like fat from a piece of meat. I breathed slowly, letting the hurt settle in my chest like a heavy stone. It wasn't the first time they'd made comments about my spending. I remembered, suddenly, painfully, how last Thanksgiving my son had said, "Mom, maybe you don't need so many streaming subscriptions," while his wife hinted that my house was too big for someone my age. My daughter had suggested I sell my car because insurance is expensive, and besides you barely go out except when we take you. They always framed these things as concern, as guidance, as if I were a confused old woman who needed direction. But there was no confusion in the way my daughter eyed my credit card statements when she thought I wasn't looking, or in how my son lingered in my office near the filing cabinet containing documents he had no business reading. I pushed those memories aside then, choosing peace over confrontation. But tonight their words landed differently, sharper, clearer, heavier. Something had changed in them, or perhaps something had changed in me. Maybe age doesn't weaken us. Maybe it simply strips away our tolerance for disrespect. I felt a small shiver as I stood up and walked through my home. The wooden floor creaked softly under my slippers, familiar and friendly. I reached the kitchen and opened the refrigerator just to see everything inside neatly arranged. The leftover chicken salad, the bowl of cut fruit my granddaughter and I shared last weekend, the half-finished bottle of iced tea. Nothing extravagant. Nothing irresponsible. Just the ordinary rhythm of a woman who had spent her entire life taking care of everyone else. As I stood there, the hum of the fridge seemed almost comforting, grounding me in the present moment. For years after my husband died, money became something I managed alone. Carefully, thoughtfully. I made mistakes early on, small ones that chipped at my confidence, but I learned. I grew stronger. I paid off what needed paying, saved what needed saving, and even gave myself a little room to breathe. Room to enjoy the twilight of my life in a way I never could when I was younger and constantly hustling between the library, PTA meetings, grocery runs, and late-night fevers my children never remembered I soothed. That credit line they used. Yes, I opened it for them willingly. At first. My son needed it for graduate school expenses that came up between semesters. My daughter used it for emergency travel, though the emergency often looked suspiciously like weekend getaways with friends. I told myself it was fine. I told myself they would pay me back. I told myself this was what mothers did. And maybe that was my mistake. Loving them without remembering to protect myself. Over time, the credit line grew from a small safety net to a convenience for them, then a habit, then an unspoken expectation. They stopped asking. They simply used it, and I let them because conflict felt heavier than debt, because loneliness makes you cling to the threads of connection even when those threads cut into your fingers. But tonight their tone told me something chilling. They didn't see themselves as borrowing from me. They saw themselves as entitled to what was mine. They saw my comfort as their discomfort. My independence as their inconvenience. My home as an untapped resource. And in that realization, a deep, sharp ache settled in my ribs, one that had nothing to do with age. I walked back to the living room and sat down again, pulling my shawl tightly around my shoulders as if I could protect myself from the betrayal creeping into my bones. I had spent my life believing that love was a kind of armor, that the years I poured into raising them would someday circle back to me in gentleness, in gratitude, in care. But love is not a bank account and memories don't pay interest. I felt foolish, embarrassed, even realizing how blind I had been. But wrapped inside the shame was something else. A quiet alertness, a long-dormant instinct waking up. I realized I couldn't just sit and swallow the insult they handed me so casually. Not anymore. I stood up again, this time with a sense of purpose, and walked to my bedroom. The carpet felt soft under my feet, reminding me of the life I built through decades of choosing usefulness over luxury, resilience over comfort, frugality over indulgence. On the nightstand sat a small wooden box, my husband's old lockbox. I opened it and took out the folder labeled financial documents. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From clarity. From awakening. From a sense of justice forming in the back of my mind like a slow, steady storm building over the horizon. I flipped through the papers until I found the document I needed, The information for the credit account my children thought I would never dare to touch. I sat in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, the quiet of the house settling around me like a protective cocoon, and whispered to myself, if they want me to live less comfortably, then maybe they should see what discomfort feels like. But I didn't decide out of anger, not yet. The decision forming in my heart came from something deeper. A desire to reclaim my dignity, my boundaries, my peace. I set the paperwork aside and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the familiar ache of loneliness pressed against my ribs. But tonight it wasn't just loneliness. There was resolve mixed in. There was strength. There was a plan forming in the quiet corners of my mind. And somewhere in that half-lit darkness I found myself whispering to the man I lost decades ago, James, I wish you were here. You'd know what to do. And though the room stayed silent, I felt for the first time in years, like I wasn't completely alone. The next morning, sunlight spilled gently through my bedroom curtains, thin, warm streams that dusted my comforter in gold. But even that familiar glow couldn't soften the heaviness inside my chest. I rose slowly, joints cracking in protest, and shuffled toward the kitchen where the kettle sat waiting, exactly where I'd left it. But as I filled it with water, my thoughts spiraled back, not to last night's confrontation, but to the very first moment things shifted years ago, when a simple request from my son should have told me everything I needed to know. It was 8 years after James died. I still wore my wedding band then, still slept on my side of the bed, still kept his slippers by the door even though dust settled inside them. Grief had hollowed me out so thoroughly that even sunlight felt like a visitor instead of a friend. That's when my son Michael came over one evening with that charming smile of his, the one he inherited from James, and asked if we could talk privately. I remember how he kept glancing around the room as if expecting witnesses, wringing his hands slightly, trying to look concerned. He told me he was short on money for a one-time work emergency, and needed a little help. Not much, he said. Not enough to burden me. Just enough to get through a tough patch. I felt a swell of purpose, a flicker of maternal usefulness returning to me. After months of feeling invisible, grieving quietly behind closed curtains, the idea that my son needed me made something warm unfurl in my chest. I told him of course I'd help. That was what mothers did. I didn't even hesitate when he suggested opening a small line of credit, just temporarily, something he would manage, something I wouldn't need to worry about. He kissed my forehead, called me the strongest woman he knew, and held my hands as if I were fragile, precious, necessary. I see now that it wasn't love speaking, it was convenience. But back then I mistook his desperation for closeness, his flattery for gratitude. That was the real red flag, the one I smoothed out and folded neatly into a drawer labeled kindness. But life has a cruel way of revealing what we ignored. A few months after that, I remember my daughter, Elise, coming to visit. She had always been different from her brother. Less affectionate, more calculating, the kind of girl who learned early how to get what she wanted without ever raising her voice. She glanced at the new garden furniture I'd bought myself, something I purchased after saving for almost a year, and she asked lightly, "Is this really the best use of your pension, Mom?" I laughed awkwardly, brushing it off, saying it had been on sale, but the comment lingered. Elise always had a way of planting seeds in my mind, seeds of doubt, guilt, self-monitoring. She often commented on my choices without ever sounding unkind, and I always wondered afterward if I was being irresponsible by wanting even small comforts. But the strangest moment came the following Christmas. I was standing at the kitchen counter carving the roast, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air, the clang of holiday music in the background, when I overheard Michael and Elise talking in the hallway. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the laughter caught my attention, and then Elise said something that made the knife slip slightly in my hand. "She won't even notice," she whispered. "She never checks it. She trusts us too much." Michael laughed softly, almost proudly. I remember tension shooting through my fingers as I gripped the counter edge. I should have walked out right then, confronted them, demanded answers. But grief clouds your clarity. Loneliness muffles your instincts. I convinced myself I had misunderstood. I told myself they were talking about something else. Anything else. I buried the suspicion under a mountain of excuses. They're joking, they didn't mean it like that, they would never take advantage of me. But now, standing in my kitchen 8 years later with the kettle beginning to whistle, I realized that moment had been the beginning of the end. They hadn't taken advantage of me suddenly. It had been gradual, a slow tightening of invisible strings. The kind of betrayal that doesn't arrive all at once but grows quietly like mold behind wallpaper. I poured the boiling water over a tea bag and watched the steam rise, curling into delicate shapes that faded before my eyes, just like the versions of my children I used to believe in. As I stirred my tea, the memories kept coming, each one peeling back the layers of denial I'd wrapped myself in. There was the time Elise suggested taking over my utility payments to make things easier, but when I asked for the bill later, she sighed dramatically and claimed she'd already covered it. Yet my account showed the payment had come from my own money. Or the time Michael promised he'd paid off the credit line but then used it again the next month. Or the time both of them tried to convince me to sign a document I hadn't fully read, saying it was just for estate planning. I didn't sign, something in me resisting for reasons I didn't understand then. Maybe James's protective instinct still lived somewhere inside me. Maybe some part of me had always known. Standing there, tea in hand, I felt the truth settle around me like dust in a quiet attic. I wasn't losing my children now. I had been losing them for years. One small boundary at a time. One borrowed dollar at a time. One manipulation disguised as concern at a time. And now they wanted more. They wanted control. They wanted my life to shrink so theirs could expand. A tremor of anger, not the loud, fiery kind but the deep, cavernous kind, moved through me. Surprised me, this anger. I hadn't felt it in so long I almost didn't recognize it. It wasn't rage, it was revelation. It was clarity. It was awakening. I sat at the table, sipping slowly, letting the bitterness of the tea ground me in the moment. As the warmth spread through my chest, I made a quiet promise to myself. I will not be erased. Not by age. Not by loneliness. And certainly not by the children I raised with my own tired hands. And in that promise something shifted, not in the room, not in the air, but inside me. The woman they thought they could manipulate was no longer sitting quietly in the shadows. She had stood up. He was paying attention. And soon, they would feel it. 2 days after that long night of remembering, when the weight of truth had finally settled into my bones like cold rainwater in old wood, my daughter showed up unannounced. I heard her car door slam outside, quick, impatient, sharp, and for a moment I stood perfectly still in the hallway, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Elise never visited without calling. She never dropped by casually. So when the knock came, 3 short raps like she was checking in on a tenant rather than seeing her mother, I felt a tension coil in my stomach, not fear but the tight, bracing kind of awareness you feel before a storm breaks. I opened the door and she stepped inside without waiting, her perfume drifting around her like a soft floral mist masking a hard intention. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It slid across her face, glossy and thin. "Mom," she said brightly, too brightly, the same sugary tone she used with bank tellers and waitresses she secretly believed were beneath her. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and I feel awful that it upset you. Upset me. As though reducing my life to a budgetary inconvenience was just a minor misunderstanding." She walked into the living room and sat down like she owned the place, crossing her legs, adjusting her expensive blazer, setting her phone on the coffee table with the screen facing up. Something she always did when she expected a call she didn't want me to hear. I didn't respond right away. I simply watched her the way you watch a sleeping snake. Beautiful, familiar, dangerous in its stillness. "I just want to help you," she continued, trying to sound sincere. But her voice had that brittle texture people get when they've rehearsed the lines too many times. "Mom, you're getting older. You shouldn't be stressed about bills or money. That's why we're here. To guide you. Guide me." The word felt like stepping on a shard of glass, small but sharp enough to draw blood. I asked her what she meant exactly, and that's when I saw the shift. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes flicked toward her phone. Her fingers tapped her knee. Then she said, "Michael and I talked. We think the best solution is for us to take a more active role in your finances. Just the essentials. Just for safety. You know how scams target elderly people. Elderly people. Not her mother. Not the woman who raised her." I felt something inside me go quiet. Not defeated but alert, like a deer standing perfectly still in the woods, sensing danger before it appears. She kept talking, words flowing out rapid fire, too polished, too coordinated. "You shouldn't be handling things on your own anymore. We can consolidate some accounts. Maybe close a few. Simplify your spending. Downsize your lifestyle. You'll feel free. Unburdened. Unburdened. That was the moment I knew the conversation wasn't about concern. It was about control. It wasn't about my comfort. It was about theirs. The air between us thickened. I could feel the memory of that Christmas whispering behind her voice. She won't notice. He trusts us too much. But I was noticing now. Every word. Every glance. Every hidden motive. I walked to the kitchen deliberately and began making tea, partly to steady myself, partly to observe her unguarded. And as soon as she thought I wasn't watching, she picked up her phone, leaned back, and whispered into it, soft, rushed words that drifted faintly to my ears. She seems open to it. I think she'll sign. I'll call you as soon as I get her to agree. My hands tightened around the teapot as I realized who she was talking to. Michael. They were coordinating, pressuring, planning. This wasn't a daughter concerned for her mother. This was a woman strategizing, maneuvering, trying to secure access to something that didn't belong to her. I walked back with the tea and sat across from her. She straightened immediately, smile back in place, her phone tucked away like the lies she thought I hadn't heard. I handed her a cup and the faintest tremor passed through her fingers. She wasn't nervous, she was impatient. She wanted this over with. She wanted my signature. Like a business deal. Like a transaction. Mom, she said softly, we should do this now. Before things get complicated. Complicated. I almost laughed. Instead, I took a slow sip of tea and looked at her. Not the daughter I raised, not the girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, not the teenager who'd slam doors but still call me from the school bathroom when she needed reassurance. No. What I saw sitting across from me was a woman who believed my age made me helpless, predictable, pliable. A woman who had mistaken my loneliness for weakness. What exactly do you want me to sign? I asked, watching her closely. Her face brightened too quickly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of papers. Neatly clipped, freshly printed, suspiciously crisp. Just a simple authorization, she said. So I can manage a few accounts. It's really just for safety. You won't even have to think about bills anymore. She placed the papers between us with the arrogance of someone who truly believed she had already won. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It creates a kind of power no one sees coming. I picked up the documents. I didn't read them, not then. I didn't need to yet. Instead, I set them aside gently, folded my hands and said, Elise dear, I need time. I don't make decisions quickly. Her smile flickered. Like, reconstructed itself, thinner this time. Of course, she said tightly. Take your time. But don't wait too long. It's important. I nodded slowly, and something in my eyes must have startled her, because she hesitated before standing. Almost like she sensed, finally, that the mother she thought she could manipulate was no longer within reach. She left shortly after, walking to her car with that stiff, clipped gait she had when things didn't go her way. And the moment her engine rumbled down the street, I locked the door, leaned my back against it, and exhaled for what felt like the first real breath in days. I went to my desk, unfolded the documents and read them line by line. And there it was, in neat legal language, giving them control. Over my accounts. My credit. My assets. My decisions. My life. They wanted ownership. Disguised as caregiving. Wrapped in false concern. And for the first time in my life I felt something stronger than hurt. Stronger than fear. A kind of liberation. A rising tide inside me that whispered, now you know. Now you see them clearly. Now the real work begins. That evening, after Elise's car disappeared into the thinning dusk and the house settled back into its ordinary hum, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the lights. I moved through the dim rooms with only the last scraps of daylight guiding me, as if the truth I had just uncovered needed the cover of darkness to be fully acknowledged. The papers she had left sat on the coffee table like a sleeping serpent, quiet, harmless-looking, camouflaged in white, but capable of biting deep. I didn't touch them again. Not yet. Instead, I walked slowly down the hallway to the little room I call my study, though it's really nothing more than an old oak desk, a bookshelf sagging under decades of journals, and a reading lamp that flickers when the weather changes. I sat down heavily, my breath catching in my throat as an old memory swelled up. James sitting where I sat now, tapping his pen against the desk, teaching our children about responsibility. Money is trust, he'd say, voice steady and warm. If someone lies about money, they'll lie about anything. The memory hit me like a cold hand closing around my spine. Elise and Michael had lied. Not once. Not twice. Repeatedly. So what else had they lied about? What else had I missed in my desperate attempt to believe the best in them? My heart thudded painfully as I reached for the drawer and pulled out my laptop. It took a moment to boot up. Old machines wake slowly like old bodies, but when the screen finally lit up, I felt a strange steadiness settle into my bones. I opened my bank accounts first, then my credit card accounts, then the credit line, the very one they had been using freely for years. I stared at the numbers. At first I thought the screen was wrong. A glitch. A mistake. Something impossible. But no. The numbers didn't lie. The balance was nearly triple what I remembered. Charges I didn't recognize. Restaurants I had never eaten at, stores I had never visited, travel bookings I had certainly never made, stretched back months, even years. Spa packages. Electronics. Rental cars. Subscription services. Weekend hotel stays. All cleverly spaced out, small enough individually to not raise alarms but numerous enough to drain me slowly, methodically, intentionally. My breath began to shake. I clicked further. The last payment made toward the balance had come from my account, not theirs, despite both my children insisting for years that they paid it off regularly. Lies. Layers and layers of lies wrapped in soft voices and fake concern. I scrolled back further, tracing the pattern. Whenever I bought something for myself, new shoes, a nice dinner, a rare treat, they would suddenly use the line more heavily the next month, as if punishing me for the audacity of caring for myself. I felt nauseous. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the desk edge until the dizziness passed, forcing myself to keep scrolling. Then I found the worst part. A transfer. Just a single line on the screen, small and cold. But it hit me harder than any insult, any argument, any betrayal in my entire life. They had attempted to move part of the credit line into an account they shared together. A joint account. Without telling me. Without permission. Without hesitation. If the bank hadn't flagged it as suspicious, I might have never known. They were trying to consolidate money. My money. Or rather, money attached to my name, my credit, my future. Not because they needed it. No, both of them made good money, at least by their own bragging. But because they wanted control. Control of me. Of my decisions. Of my life. My chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. My children, my own flesh and blood, had been siphoning from me for years like vines wrapping around an old tree, slowly choking the life out of it while pretending to offer shade. I felt shame first, hot burning shame that bloomed across my skin. How had I been so blind? How had I let them speak to me like a child? How had I allowed myself to shrink so small inside my own life? But then another feeling rose. Something deeper, old, familiar, powerful. The same feeling I had the day I buried James. The day I stood alone, surrounded by people who didn't know how strong I truly was. The day I realized I would survive even the worst heartbreak. That feeling was returning now, rising slowly from the hollow place inside me where I had stored every disappointment, every lonely morning, every whispered doubt. Strife. Cold, steady strife. I sat up straighter, my fingers trembling slightly as I closed the laptop. The numbers burned behind my eyelids, but the fear they once would have triggered was gone. Something else took its place. Resolve. Clarity. A quiet fury that didn't shout or shake but settled into me like iron being forged in fire. I whispered into the dim room, "You will not take anything else from me." The words sounded strange in my voice, stronger, firmer, almost unfamiliar. As if someone braver had spoken through me. I stood, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water and drank slowly, letting each sip wash away another layer of denial. Then I looked toward the hallway, toward the room that held James's lockbox. I knew what I needed to do. And I knew I would do it without warning, without trembling, without guilt. They wanted me to live less comfortably. They believed they could make choices for me. They thought age made me powerless. They had no idea the storm they had awakened. I woke up on a Thursday morning, cold light spilling through the blinds, that kind of weak winter sun that pretends it's warm but carries no heat at all. And before I even swung my legs over the side of the bed, I felt it. Something in the house was wrong. Silence. But not peaceful silence. Heavy silence. The kind that wraps around your throat. It took me nearly a full minute to realize what had changed, and when I did, I sat absolutely still, my fingers gripping the blanket. The heat wasn't on. The hum from the furnace, my constant companion for 20 years, was gone. At first I told myself it was probably a tripped breaker or maybe a power glitch. But then I saw the flashing red light on the digital thermostat. Disconnected. Not malfunctioning. Disconnected. And suddenly, every conversation over the past months replayed in my mind like a cruel montage. You should live less comfortably, Grandma. Cut expenses. Your bills are too high. You're too old to be this cushioned. Every remark that I had brushed off as immature or rude now formed a single, undeniable truth. My own grandchildren, the ones who had access to my accounts, the ones who swore they were helping with online payments, had shut off my heating. On purpose. My hands shook as I made my way through the hall. My slippers made soft shuffling sounds against the cold floorboards. When I reached the kitchen, my breath was visible in the air. I pressed a trembling palm against the window. Actual ice forming along the inside edge. And the bill on the counter, printed, placed neatly like an accusation, confirmed everything. Automatic payment. Cancelled. In the slot where a signature should have been, there it was, their name, not mine. I don't remember sitting down. I only remember the sound, a small cracking inside my chest like thin glass snapping. These children I loved, the ones I took to piano practice, the ones I handmade quilts for, the ones I protected from their parents' arguments, had decided that saving themselves a little money mattered more than my safety. More than my dignity. More than my life. Because let's be honest, a woman my age left without heat in the dead of winter? That's not an inconvenience. That's a threat. A quiet, plausible deniability kind of threat. The kind no one can prove. The kind that gets read as tragic accident in the papers. And they knew it. They absolutely knew it. The cold crept deeper into my bones as I forced myself to move. I boiled a kettle just to warm my hands over the steam. I wrapped myself in 3 blankets, sat on the edge of my chair, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely afraid inside my own home. Not shaky fear. Not emotional fear. Survival fear. My house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a hunting ground. And the hunters were the very people I once rocked to sleep. I should have called someone right then, my neighbor, the police, anyone, but shame glued my mouth shut. When you reach my age, you don't want to be the elderly woman calling because her family mistreated her. You don't want pity. You don't want the whispers. You don't want the world looking at you like you're fragile, naive, stupid. So instead, I sat there and silently suffered. For hours, the cold pressed into me until my joints screamed and my fingers turned slow and wooden. I could barely open a jar. I could barely hold a pen. And that was the moment, the exact moment, when I realized the real betrayal wasn't the heat being cut off. It was the fact that they felt safe doing it. They believed I was powerless. Invisible. Too old to fight. Too old to defend myself. Too old to matter. That's what they were really counting on. My silence. My weakness. My fear. And that is what lit the first spark in me. Not rage. Not revenge. Something quieter. Something steadier. Something older. Well, hours later, wrapped in my blankets, I heard the crunch of tires in my driveway. My granddaughter, the only one who still treated me like a human being instead of a financial inconvenience, burst through the door with a 12-pack of oat milk and a grocery bag in her arms. "Grandma," she called out, her voice catching when she saw me sitting there in my layers, my breath fogging in the air. The groceries dropped from her hands. "Why is it so cold in here?" She rushed to the thermostat, pressed the buttons, frowned, then followed the wire down the wall. When she saw the cut, clean, deliberate, her face drained of color. "Who did this?" she whispered. And when I didn't answer because my throat felt full of stones, she pieced it together. "It was them, wasn't it?" She sank to her knees beside me, tears stinging her eyes as she grabbed my hands. "Grandma, they could have killed you." I didn't correct her. Because she was right. That night, after she called a technician and had my heat restored out of her own savings, after she brought me soup and sat watching me like she was afraid I'd disappear, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I'd been shrinking, folding myself into smaller versions to keep the peace, trying to convince myself that maybe the disrespect was just misunderstanding, that maybe I was imagining the cruelty. But now I knew. Wrong had been done to me intentionally, strategically, and quietly. And a strange calm came over me. Not bitterness. Not even anger. Just clarity. If they wanted me weak, I would be strong. If they wanted me quiet, I would speak. If they thought they could strip away my safety, I would strip away theirs, legally, intelligently, and with the same quiet precision they had used on me. And so, wrapped in my warm robe that night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and began writing, Not a revenge plan, but a reclamation plan. A plan to take back everything they thought I was too old to guard. A plan to protect my future and expose their intentions. A plan to remind myself and them that comfort was not theirs to take. And that the woman they underestimated was not finished. Not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because my mind wouldn't stop turning. There's a strange clarity that comes when someone finally shows you who they truly are. It's almost like light scattering across shattered glass. Once it breaks, you see reflections you never noticed before. Every receipt they handled, every automatic payment they insisted on managing, every time they pressured me to be more responsible, I saw it all under a new, unforgiving lens. They hadn't just unplugged my comfort, they'd been training me to stop questioning them. And that realization cut deeper than any winter chill ever could. So I sat at the table wrapped in my robe, steam rising from my mug of tea, and began digging. First through the mail drawer, 3 years of statements, invoices, insurance papers, stacks they assured me they'd already checked. Then into the filing cabinet where I kept records, not because I understood all of them, but because I grew up in a generation that saved everything. Back then I thought I was being sentimental. Now I realized I'd accidentally preserved the evidence of my own exploitation. It started small. A double payment here. A missing authorization there. Little gaps and rounding errors that looked harmless on their own. But when lined up month after month, handwritten into rows in my notebook, a pattern emerged. A pattern that told the story they hoped I would never read. They weren't just managing my accounts. They were siphoning from them. Quietly. Steadily. Confident that the old woman who hates computers would never know. And the worst part? They had been doing it for over a year. When that truth settled in my chest, it felt like grief at first, grief for the children I thought I knew, grief for the trust I'd given them freely. But then something else rose inside me. Certainty. Certainty that if they were comfortable taking from me, they would keep taking. Certainty that this wasn't a misunderstanding. Certainty that I needed to protect myself before they made another move. My granddaughter arrived mid-morning with pastries and a determined look in her eyes, ready to help however she could. I slid the notebook toward her, open to the columns of numbers I'd been organizing. Her brows knitted together as she read, and with each passing minute her expression darkened. "Grandma, this isn't an accident. This is theft." Her voice trembled with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She wasn't asking. She was stating a fact. And hearing it from someone young, someone who understood technology and finances in a way I didn't, cemented what my gut had already screamed. They'd been draining me dry. I felt my throat tighten, but not with tears. With resolve. And then, in a moment that still feels like fate, my granddaughter leaned closer and whispered, "Do you want to know everything? Because I can show you." I nodded. And that's when the floodgates opened. She logged into my banking dashboard, something I'd never even seen before because they always handled it. Passwords saved under their name. Access from their devices. A trail of small transfers labeled shared expenses, family costs, reimbursements. Except there were no shared expenses. No reimbursements. No family cost. Just a quiet little funnel. From my accounts to theirs. She clicked into my credit profile next, and I swear my heart stopped. I had 3 credit cards I'd never opened. Cards with balances. Cards connected to my address but not my signature. Cards they used freely, restaurants, online shopping, even plane tickets. I felt dizzy. Sick. Violated. I don't think anything prepares you for the realization that the people who once kissed your cheeks goodnight have turned you into their personal ATM. My granddaughter's voice grew small as she scrolled. "Grandma, they didn't think you'd ever look. That's why they got sloppy." But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the message she found next. Hidden in a shared family drive folder, titled innocently as Budget Planning, was a spreadsheet outlining projected use of Grandma's resources. My name was a line item. A resource. A strategy. A supply. Next to each month were the allocations they intended to pull. 6 months from now, it said, move management of assets fully to us. A year from now, sell property. Grandma moves in with, the rest was cut off. But the meaning was unmistakable. They had already written my future in numbers. They had already planned my reduction. My displacement. My erasure. I felt tears sting my eyes, not because of what they took but because of what they intended to take. My independence. My home. My final years. My granddaughter closed the laptop gently as though handling something radioactive. Grandma, what do you want to do? Her voice cracked. For a long moment I didn't speak. I watched the dust dance in the air between us, swirling in the sunlight like tiny ghosts. Then quietly I said, I want to take back what's mine. Without shouting. Without drama. I want to reclaim my life the same way they tried to steal it, quietly, carefully, and completely. She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. Then we'll start with the paper trail. Because they left one. She reached for her phone. And I know exactly who can help us. What she did next still amazes me. She called her friend's mother, a financial investigator who specialized in elder financial abuse. A woman who had seen this exact story 100 times. When my granddaughter explained what we'd found, the woman didn't gasp. She didn't sound surprised. She only said, I'm coming over. And within an hour she was sitting at my table with a legal pad, glasses perched at the end of her nose, asking me calm, steady questions. When did you give them access? Did you ever explicitly authorize transfers? Do you have reason to feel unsafe? With every answer I gave, her expression grew firmer, not alarmed but resolute. You have more power than you think, she finally said. And we're going to help you use it. That was the moment right then that I stopped being afraid. Because for the first time in a long while I wasn't alone. I had allies. I had proof. And I had a truth that was now too loud to ignore. As they flipped through my records, I felt something in my spine straighten. My voice returned. My mind sharpened. My years didn't make me weak, they made me patient, observant, intelligent in ways they'd forgotten. And as I watched the investigator highlight numbers and make notes in the margins, a soft, steady thought rose inside me, warm as sunrise. They wanted me to live less comfortably. Fine. Let's see how they handle living with consequences. The investigator, her name was Helen, returned the next morning with a leather folder, a portable scanner, and a calmness that soothed something inside me. She moved through my paperwork like a surgeon, peeling apart years of confusion with quiet precision. Every few minutes she would murmur things like, "This is unlawful," or "They didn't cover their tracks at all," or "They assumed you'd never have support." Each sentence restored another inch of my dignity. My granddaughter sat beside me, her leg bouncing anxiously, watching every movement like she was guarding me from the world. And as Helen scanned documents, cross-checked dates, and scribbled notes, I felt my old self, my real self, begin to rise again from beneath the months of humiliation. That morning, with frost still clinging to the edges of my windows, we laid out the first stage of what Helen called a quiet reclamation strategy. She explained it gently, as though speaking to someone fragile, but I surprised her by following every detail. My mind wasn't foggy, just wounded. And wounds can heal. The plan had 3 parts. Secure my accounts, cut off their access, and observe how they reacted. She said something I'll never forget. People who steal expect silence. When silence breaks, their behavior reveals everything. So the first thing we did was close every online portal they had created. Passwords changed. Access revoked. Cards canceled. New accounts opened. My financial life was slowly peeled out of their hands like a thread pulled from greedy fingers. And let me tell you, I felt something electric inside me as we worked. A quiet fire. Not revenge, no. Just the reawakening of a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. Next, Helen had me sign a statement outlining what I remembered. When I first gave them access, what explanations they'd given, how I'd felt pressured, the sudden drop in heat, the less comfortable comments. Each line felt like shedding a layer of fear. My handwriting trembled, but my resolve didn't. My granddaughter kept refilling my tea like a nurse at a battlefield ward, whispering, "You're doing the right thing, Grandma." And I believed her. But the real turning point, the real shift, came when Helen leaned forward, folded her hands, and said quietly, "Now we wait. And we watch." It didn't take long. The next morning, at exactly 9:17 a.m., my phone began vibrating on the counter like a wasp trapped in a jar. First one call. Then another. Then a third. Their names lighting up my screen one after another. But I didn't answer. I just stared at the phone, feeling that strange tightening in my chest, a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. The fourth call came with a voicemail, panicked, breathless, pretending to be concerned. "Grandma, hey, we're just checking in. Something weird is happening with the bank. Did you change something? We really need to talk to you." They sounded frantic, but not about me. About their access. Their comfort. The sudden disappearance of the easy money they'd been siphoning. For a brief moment I felt a flicker of guilt because despite everything, the heart remembers love even when the mind remembers betrayal. But then I remembered the cold in my bones the night the heat was cut off. I remembered seeing my breath in my own kitchen. I remembered being almost erased on paper. And just like that, the guilt dissolved. Hours passed. More calls. More texts. Each one grew more urgent. One even tried guilt. "Grandma, we've been helping you. Why would you shut us out like this?" It was surreal. They had no idea the woman they assumed was powerless was sitting upright in her chair, answering nothing, watching them spin. Helen told me to save every message. "This is their real voice," she said. "People reveal themselves when the benefits disappear." And reveal themselves they did. By late afternoon the tone shifted. The sweetness evaporated. The panic sharpened into irritation. "Grandma, this is really inconvenient. We need to talk now. You can't just change things without telling us." The shift was stunning and educational. Love does not transform into frustration when money is lost. Entitlement does. And seeing that entitlement so clearly without excuses, stripped the last remnants of denial from me. My granddaughter saw it too. She read one of the messages, pressed her lips tightly and whispered, "I'm so sorry you ever trusted them." But I shook my head. "No," I said quietly. "I'm only sorry I ignored the signs." The first true test came that evening when they showed up at my door, knocking, then knocking harder, calling my name through the wood. My heart pounded, not from fear but from the gravity of the moment. Helen had warned me this might happen. She positioned herself discreetly behind the partially drawn curtain where she could witness without being noticed. My granddaughter stood beside me, squeezing my hand. I approached the door slowly, my slippers brushing the rug, and for the first time in months, I felt fully in control. I didn't open the door. I simply stood near it and said through the wood, "I'm resting. I'm not available." The silence that followed was thick, stunned. Then one of them tried to play innocent again. "Grandma, we're worried. Please let us in." I didn't move. Didn't respond. Didn't let them reclaim the space of my home, my peace, or my weakness. After several minutes, they left, angry footsteps crunching down my walkway. And when I peeked through the curtain, I saw their faces twisted not with concern, but with frustration. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the end of their comfort. That night, after they drove away, I sat by the fireplace, real heat now warming my knees, and felt something settle over me like a soft blanket. I had taken the first step. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Carefully. And beautifully. I had created distance. I had reclaimed access. I had disrupted their assumptions. And most importantly, I had shown both them and myself that I was no longer the woman they could control, manipulate, or diminish. My granddaughter curled beside me on the couch, resting her head on my shoulder, whispering, "I'm proud of you." And maybe for the first time in years I felt proud of myself too. Because power, I realized, doesn't always come from youth or strength or shouting. Sometimes it comes from silence. From patience. From the steady reclaiming of pieces of yourself you didn't even know you'd given away. And as I closed my eyes that night, listening to the soft hiss of the fire, I felt ready. Ready for whatever came next. Ready for the next step in my quiet war. Ready to keep walking forward, one steady breath at a time, toward a life no one would ever try to shrink again. The next 72 hours unfolded like a slow, relentless truth-telling, the kind that doesn't scream or explode but reveals itself in small, cutting slices until the whole picture becomes undeniable. By the time Sunday morning came, I already knew what was coming. I could feel it in the tremor of my phone, in the clipped tone of their messages, in the way entitlement always curdles into anger when the supply is cut off. I woke before sunrise, the house still dark, the quiet thick as cloth. I sat at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of ginger tea and listened to the refrigerator hum, thinking of how peaceful my home used to be when they visited as children, sticky hands, laughter trailing behind them, eyes wide at the smell of cinnamon rolls. I wondered when that innocence had dissolved into greed. I wondered if I had missed some early sign, some subtle shift, or if this betrayal was something adulthood had carved into them. But as the sky lightened from navy to pale gray, I reminded myself that wondering wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was knowing. And I knew enough. Around 9 the knock came, not frantic this time, not panicked. Slow. Measured. Intentional. My granddaughter stiffened beside me on the couch, her phone poised, ready to record if necessary. Helen, who had stayed nearby just in case, positioned herself in the hallway where she could hear but remain unseen. I stood, my robe brushing my ankles, and walked toward the door with a calmness that surprised even me. I didn't open it, of course I didn't. I simply asked, "Who is it?" And perhaps it was the tone of my voice, steady, unshaken, that made the first mask slip. "It's us," one of them answered, the words clipped. "We need to talk now." Not Grandma. Not "Are you okay?" Not even a soft greeting. Just urgency laced with irritation. It set the stage for everything that followed. I rested my hand lightly on the doorknob but did not turn it. "I'm not receiving visitors," I said. Silence. Then a laugh, sharp, humorless. "What's going on with you? Are you confused? Did someone put ideas in your head?" But there was the old standby. Discredit the elder so the truth loses weight. Helen had warned me. My granddaughter clenched her jaw, fists balled at her sides. I inhaled slowly, letting their words slide off me like oil on glass. "I'm perfectly clear," I said softly. Too clear, in fact. And something in that sentence must have pierced their composure, because the tone shifted instantly, sweetness coating their voice like artificial sugar. "Grandma, we're worried. We just want to help you." But the sweetness was forced, brittle around the edges. "I have all the help I need," I answered. Another beat. "Then, did someone tell you to do this? Because cutting off the accounts without talking to us first, it's irrational. It's unsafe." The word nearly made me laugh. The people who shut off my heat, who drained my accounts, who wrote my future plans into a spreadsheet as if I were a corporate asset, they were worried about my safety. I felt a strange kind of strength bloom in my chest, quiet, firm, rooted. "I made the changes myself," I said. "And they were necessary." The voice on the other side hardened. "If you don't open this door, we're going to assume someone is manipulating you. And we will take action." That was the first real crack. Because the threat wasn't subtle, it was unmistakable. "What kind of action?" I asked. "We'll get legal involvement if we have to. We're not letting anyone take advantage of you." The irony stung so sharply it almost tasted metallic. My granddaughter stepped closer, ready to intervene, but I held up a hand to steady her. I didn't want shouting. I didn't need a confrontation. I just needed the truth, exposed in their own voices. So I asked the question I had been waiting to ask. "Why are you so upset about no longer having access to my accounts?" Pause. A long one. Too long. "Because we were managing things for you." "Were you?" I asked quietly. "Or were you managing things for yourselves?" Their answer came too fast, too defensive. "What is that supposed to mean?" I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the doorframe. "It means I know," I said simply. Silence fell like a stone. Heavy. Dense. Absolute. Then the softest shift, the inhale of someone realizing the ground beneath them has tilted. "Know what?" they whispered. "Everything." I said the word gently, but it hit like a hammer. They tried to recover. "You don't understand how banking works. You're being misled. But the sentence cut off because my granddaughter stepped forward and said, loud enough to be heard through the door, "We have proof." All of it. The hallway beyond the door went still. Still like fear. Still like guilt. Still like the moment before a structure collapses under its own weight. When the voice returned, it was unrecognizable, tight, furious, cornered. "You're making a huge mistake." "No," I said softly. "The mistake was trusting you." Another long silence followed, and I could almost feel them processing the new imbalance of power they once assumed was theirs by default. Eventually their footsteps retreated down the walkway, slower this time, heavier. Their departure didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation of every red flag I'd ignored, every uneasy feeling I'd buried, every excuse I'd made on their behalf. I watched through the curtain as they got into their car, faces stiff with anger. And as they drove away without a backward glance, something loosened inside me. A knot that had been tightening for months finally gave way, unraveling into a calm so deep it felt like warm water closing around me. Later that evening, the three of us, my granddaughter Helen and I, sat together in the living room, reviewing the documents once more. "They know the walls are closing in," Helen said. "This is when we stay steady. No reactions. No engagement. Just documentation. My granddaughter squeezed my hand. You were stronger today than I've ever seen you. But I didn't feel strong. I felt awake. Awake in a way I hadn't been for years. I realized that age hadn't taken my power, trust had. And now that trust was gone, a different version of me was returning. A clearer one. A braver one. A version who understood that silence could be armor and boundaries could be salvation. As the fire crackled and the night settled around the house, I whispered something I hadn't said out loud in decades. They thought they knew me. But they forgot who raised them. They forgot my spine. And in that moment, I knew part 9 of my story wasn't about fear. It was about revelation. About standing at the edge of the truth and choosing to step forward instead of shrinking back. Because their masks had finally slipped and mine had finally come off too. By the time the first hints of winter crept into the air and the sun began dipping earlier each evening, the house had shifted from a battlefield into something colder. An abandoned kingdom whose former rulers still paced the halls, refusing to accept their dethroning. Every day I watched them unravel a little more. Every morning they whispered among themselves, huddled like conspirators whose plots had fallen apart, trying to piece together what had happened and why I was no longer the soft barrier they could push into whenever they needed money, comfort, or someone to blame. But I kept my silence. Silence, I'd learned, was more powerful than shouting. Silence made people reveal themselves. And reveal themselves they did. It was a Thursday morning when the house's fragile peace ripped open. The tension had been building for days, suspicious glares, slamming drawers, frantic phone calls, and the unmistakable rustling of paperwork behind closed doors. I had already guessed they were scrambling to find alternatives to the credit line I had shut down. And I also knew the truth. None of them had the financial discipline, the trustworthiness, or the credit scores to repair what they had destroyed. Still, I expected resistance. I expected manipulation. I expected guilt trips, emotional theatrics, maybe even threats. But nothing prepared me for the moment when their desperation crossed a line I had prayed they would never dare approach. It began with the sound of a box dropping on the stairs, heavy, followed by a muffled yelp. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw them carrying bundles of items in their arms. My coats, my childhood photo albums, even kitchen appliances I had bought. They were loading them into bags as if preparing for some kind of emergency evacuation. But my stomach dropped when I saw what was resting by their feet. My safe. Not the big one they knew about. The small one they weren't supposed to know existed. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs as I walked down the stairs, forcing my face to remain calm. "What," I asked softly, "are you planning to do with that?" They froze. Every head snapped toward me with the look of children caught stealing, though none of them would admit guilt even then. Their expressions hardened, reluctant at first, then defiant, then finally cruel. It was my sister who spoke first, jaw tight and voice trembling with frustration more than shame. "We need it," she snapped. "We don't have cash. You shut everything down. What did you expect us to do?" I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on the safe. "You broke into my room. You weren't helping us," another accused. "You forced our hand." Forced their hand. The phrasing hit me like a slap. I had spent years believing I was choosing to support them, choosing to make things easier, choosing to keep the peace. But hearing those words, those sharp, self-pitying, ungrateful words, made something in me fracture. It was like watching a glass window crack from the center outward, the lines spreading until the whole thing was irreparably damaged. "No," I said quietly. "I didn't force anything. You chose to depend on me. You chose not to grow. You chose not to change. And now you're choosing to steal from me." The room went silent. For the first time I saw something flicker in their eyes, fear not of me but of what losing me meant. Without my income, my credit, my stability, their own lives were beginning to buckle. Their jobs weren't enough to sustain their lifestyles. Their habits, shopping, dining out, avoiding responsibility were catching up to them. And this time they had no backup plan. My mother stepped forward slowly, her face soft, sorrowful even. "Please, just unlock it. Just let us take what we need. Only this once. We won't ask again." Her voice almost fooled me. Almost. But I had seen enough to know better. "If you take even a single thing from that safe," I said, steady as steel, "I will press charges." Shock flared across their faces. Not because they thought I was bluffing, but because they realized I wasn't. "You wouldn't," my sister whispered, voice thin with disbelief. I would, I said. And I will. The quiet that followed was the kind that sucked the air out of a room. My mother, always the master manipulator in a velvet disguise, tried again, this time with trembling hands and a soft plea. We're family. You can't put us out like this. Something in me hardened. I didn't put you out, I said. You did that to yourselves. I picked up the safe with both hands, lifted it off the floor and carried it back upstairs. They didn't follow. None of them dared. They stood frozen in the hallway as if they had just witnessed something they didn't know I was capable of, self-respect. When I reached my room, I closed the door and locked it, my breath shaking as I set the safe on the floor. I stood still for a long time, letting the hot burn behind my eyes fade. I wasn't sad. And I wasn't angry. I was grieving. Grieving the version of me who once believed love meant giving endlessly until there was nothing left. But that version of me was gone. That afternoon, the house became a storm again. They whispered. They blamed me. They accused me of heartlessness. They paced like cornered animals, trying to come up with another way out of the disaster they had created. And by evening, I heard their final attempt, an idea so reckless it would become the turning point of everything that followed. They were planning to move out. Not out of independence. Out of spite. They intended to leave me with the entire burden of the mortgage, the bills, everything. They thought it would punish me. They thought it would break me. They didn't know I had already made arrangements. They didn't know I had my own plan. They didn't know that I was the one preparing to leave them behind. And soon they would learn that forcing someone to live less comfortably only works if you haven't spent your entire life relying on their comfort for your survival. Their comfort, I realized, had always depended on my sacrifice. But now they were about to feel what real discomfort looked like. Because the next move was mine. And I was done being generous. By the time the week had turned, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from tension to a subtle, simmering dread. I could feel it in every glance my children cast toward me, every pause in their conversations, every text message that went unanswered. The beauty of quiet power, I realized, is that it often arrives unseen, like a tide that creeps in slowly before drowning the shore. And while they had assumed I would remain passive, fearful, and pliable, I had spent those days not reacting, not lashing out, but observing. Watching their desperation, their growing frustration, their inability to access funds they had treated as their birthright. It was like seeing a storm form across the horizon, feeling the wind shift before it hit. Each day they became more erratic, their tactics more transparent, their voices louder with panic. All while I sat calmly, notebook in hand, tea steaming beside me, tracing their every move in quiet detail. The legal documents Helen had prepared were ready for submission, but we held them back strategically. Part of me wanted them to experience the panic of knowing that every dishonest act had been traced, every irregularity recorded. The moment of revelation would be theirs, and I would not rush it. In this pause, my granddaughter became my anchor, reminding me to breathe, to rest, to appreciate the sense of control I had so long been denied. She helped me review old bank statements, ensuring nothing was overlooked. With each line, I felt the weight of my years transform into clarity, into intelligence, into precise, deliberate strength. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a fortress, one I had reclaimed piece by piece, using patience as my most potent weapon. I realized how often I had underestimated myself, how years of kindness and trust had been mistaken for weakness. Now every calculated silence, every measured response, every calm observation was armor, and I wore it with quiet pride. The first confrontation that truly rattled them occurred on a Saturday morning. Elise, my daughter, approached me in the kitchen, voice soft but trembling with the first hint of fear I had ever seen from her. "Mom, we just want to understand," she said, as if understanding could undo years of manipulation. I met her gaze directly, my expression neutral, my words measured. "Then you will," I said softly, "because everything you've done has been documented. Every transfer, every shared expense, every alteration of my accounts. And now I am no longer granting access." Her lips parted in disbelief. The anger that followed was slow, deliberate, and almost theatrical in its quietness. "You can't do this," she whispered sharply. "We've done so much for you. How could you betray us?" My hand rested on the countertop, steady as a rock, and I responded in a tone that was gentle, almost tender, but sharp enough to cut through the years of entitlement. You were never helping me. You were helping yourselves. That is the betrayal you chose, not I. By mid-afternoon, their frantic calls and desperate visits escalated. They assumed I would panic, that I would relent, that I would restore access if I felt threatened or guilty. But I remained steadfast, silent when necessary, speaking only when clarity demanded it. Their faces twisted as they realized that the very tactics that had controlled me for years now had no effect. Every manipulation, every false claim of concern, every threat of legal action or social censure bounced off the walls of my newfound resolve. It was the first time they experienced power without leverage, control without permission, and their discomfort was a quiet, exquisite justice. I knew the moment had come to make my move visible. Helen guided me through the next steps, filing the reports, submitting the evidence, and formally revoking their access. But even before that, I chose a moment of subtle confrontation. I invited them into the living room one by one, not for debate, not for argument, but to speak calmly, truthfully, and directly. You will not manipulate me, I said to Elise, looking her in the eyes, because manipulation relies on fear. And fear no longer resides here. I could see her lips tighten. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had. Every word I had withheld, every act of patience had built this moment. I wasn't loud. I wasn't cruel. I was precise. And in that precision they found themselves cornered, powerless, and exposed. By evening, my children had begun to realize that the world they had taken for granted, the world built on my trust, my kindness, and my willingness to forgive, was no longer theirs. They moved like actors who had just forgotten their lines, improvising in panic, attempting to assert authority where none existed. And yet I remained still, observing, listening, waiting, because quiet strength doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't need to force submission. It simply exists, undeniable, and all who encounter it must adjust their behavior accordingly. That night, I sat by the fire, my granddaughter at my side, Helen reviewing the final notes for submission. I reflected on the long journey, the nights of uncertainty, the moments of quiet despair, the creeping realization that those I loved could become my adversaries. And I realized that the most profound form of revenge is not loud or violent, but calculated, calm, and fair. It's the reclaiming of your life, the re-establishment of boundaries, the insistence that truth prevails over entitlement. In those hours, I felt an immense sense of pride, not because I had hurt anyone, but because I had preserved myself. I had honored my values. I had ensured that comfort and security were no longer taken for granted. By the time sleep arrived, heavy and welcome, I felt the strange thrill of peace mixed with power. My children's world had shifted. Their comfort was now contingent on honesty and accountability, not manipulation and access. And I, once underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed, had risen not with fury, but with calm, measured intelligence, proving that true power is often quiet, deliberate, and rooted in integrity. I drifted into sleep with the warmth of the fire at my feet, my hands no longer trembling, my heart steady. I had survived betrayal, exposed deceit, and reclaimed authority over my own life. And I knew, deep within me, that the coming days would only solidify the lessons they were about to learn. That a woman underestimated for her age can, in silence, wield the most formidable strength of all. The days that followed were quieter than I had imagined. Not silent, there was still tension, still the low hum of uneasy glances and careful words, but the chaos had lost its teeth. My children were present, but in a different way. Tentative, aware, forced into accountability by the careful measures I had put in place. They still tried small manipulations, brief attempts to push boundaries, but each time I responded not with anger or shouting, but with the calm insistence that comes from knowing your ground is solid. My granddaughter often watched from the sidelines, her hand finding mine in quiet solidarity. "You've changed everything," she said once, voice low, almost awed. I smiled softly and told her it hadn't been me changing the world, it had been reclaiming my place in it. The house, once heavy with betrayal and cold air, slowly transformed into a home again. The fire crackled in the hearth, warming the living room, filling the space with a golden glow that seemed to seep into the corners where shadows had once lurked. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, brushing my fingers across familiar surfaces, and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: belonging. This was my space, my decisions, my comfort. And no one could take that from me again, not quietly, not under the guise of care, not ever. I thought back to the first time I had discovered the misused credit line, the night the heat had been cut, the slow unraveling of trust that had threatened to erase my autonomy. And I realized something profound. The very things that had been designed to break me had instead forged a version of myself I had almost forgotten existed. Strong, wise, patient, fearless in the face of manipulation. The legal proceedings, handled with Helen's guidance, were precise and fair. I did not seek vengeance in the form of punishment or humiliation. My goal had never been to destroy them. My goal had been to reclaim my life and establish boundaries so solid that deceit could no longer touch me. And in that, justice had been served, not loudly, not with spectacle, but quietly, with clarity and precision. They learned finally that comfort is not entitlement, that trust is earned, not assumed, and that actions, however gentle their disguise, have consequences. Watching them adjust to this reality was bittersweet. Part of me mourned what our family had become, the innocence lost, the simple joy replaced by greed. But another part, deeper, steadier, rejoiced in the restoration of fairness, the knowledge that truth had its day. My granddaughter became my greatest companion in this new chapter. Together we nurtured the home, organized the accounts, and even started small projects I had long postponed, painting a mural in the hallway, planting bulbs in the garden, cooking recipes I hadn't tried in decades. Her laughter returned to the rooms in a way that felt restorative, as though her presence was the final stitch in the quilt of security and love I had sewn for myself. And at night, when the house settled into its usual rhythm, I would sit in my favorite chair, journal in hand, reflecting on the journey. I wrote not just the facts of what had happened, but the lessons embedded in each betrayal, each moment of fear, each step toward reclaiming my life. I wrote of patience, of quiet strength, of the understanding that one can be both gentle and formidable, both loving and unyielding. I also reflected on forgiveness, not the blind, naive forgiveness of years past, but the deliberate, measured forgiveness that comes with wisdom. I forgave my children not for what they did, but because holding on to anger would have only poisoned me. I forgave myself for the years of trust that had been taken advantage of, because in those choices, I had also demonstrated love, patience, and hope. And in that forgiveness I found freedom. Winter faded into spring, and with it came new life and renewal. The sunlight spilled through the windows in the mornings, warm and generous, touching every surface, every corner, reminding me of the beauty of living fully without compromise. I took walks in the neighborhood, breathing the air, noticing the small miracles of life. A robin perched on a fence, the soft scent of blooming flowers, the whisper of leaves in the wind. Each day, each step, reinforced a truth I had long forgotten. Comfort, dignity, and peace are not granted by others, they are claimed, guarded, and nurtured from within. And in those moments of reflection, I understood the deepest lesson of all. Power is not loud. It does not require spectacle or domination. True power is quiet. It is steady. It is earned over years, tested in trials, and revealed in the way one maintains calm when others attempt to destroy them. I had learned this not in books, not in lectures, but in the intimate, painful crucible of betrayal and recovery. And I had emerged not only unbroken but wiser, freer, and profoundly at peace. The house no longer felt like a place of conflict. It was a sanctuary. The accounts, the keys, the safe, they were symbols of my autonomy, yes, but more than that, they were reminders that I had taken my life back. That I had faced manipulation and deceit and had chosen intelligence, patience, and clarity over rage. That I had become a living testament to the strength that comes with age, experience, and self-respect. As I sat in the evening glow, my granddaughter curled beside me with a book in her lap. I whispered softly, not to anyone in particular, but to myself, the house, the years that had shaped me. I survived. I reclaimed. I am at peace. And in that moment, I understood that the storm had passed, leaving behind something infinitely more valuable than victory. Wisdom, clarity, and the profound, unwavering knowledge that I would never again allow anyone, no matter how close, to take from me what was mine. Because I had learned the ultimate truth. Comfort, dignity, and peace are never given, they are claimed, protected, and lived. And in claiming them, I had discovered the quietest, most beautiful form of power: freedom.